Donc, bon, je me présente, je m'appelle Antonio San-Martin, je suis professeur au département de langue moderne et de traduction de l'Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. Aujourd'hui, j'ai le grand plaisir de vous présenter la professeure Lynne Bowker qui nous donnera un séminaire très intéressant dans quelques instants. Mais avant de commencer, je vais donner quelques petites instructions, comme je viens de dire, et je vais également présenter brièvement les travaux de la professeure Bowker. Donc d'abord, je le ferai en français, ensuite en anglais, au cas où nous aurions un participant qui ne parle pas français. First, I will give some instructions in French on how to interact during the meeting, and then I will do the same in English. Afin de mieux gérer le temps, nous avons décidé que les questions et commentaires seront faits à la fin de la présentation. Bien que le séminaire soit en anglais, la professeure Bowker a gentiment accepté de répondre aux questions en français également. Pour poser une question à la fin, vous pouvez le faire par écrit et dans ce cas, mon collègue Éric Poirier, également présent ici, et professeur au département de langue moderne et de traduction de l'Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières, lira les questions à la professeure Bowker. Vous pouvez également poser vos questions en utilisant votre microphone et votre webcam si vous le souhaitez. Veuillez simplement noter que le séminaire est enregistré et sera diffusé sur YouTube. Dans ce cas, avant de connecter votre audio et votre vidéo, indiquez votre intérêt au moyen du clavardage et le professeur Poirier ou moi-même vous donnerons la parole. In order to better manage time, we have decided that questions and comments will be made at the end of the presentation. Although the seminar is in English, Professor Bowker has kindly agreed to answer questions in French as well. If you wish to ask a question at the end, you may do so in writing, in which case my colleague Éric Poirier, also a professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Translation at the University of Quebec in Trois-Rivières, will read the questions to Professor Bowker. You can also ask your questions using your microphone and your webcam if you wish. Just note that the seminar is recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. In this case, just before connecting your audio and video, please indicate your interest in the chat and Professor Poirier or myself will let you know when to speak. Et enfin, je présente la professeure Bowker et je lui donne la parole car nous attendons tous avec impatience le séminaire. Donc, alors la professeure Bowker est titulaire d'un doctorat en ingénierie linguistique de l'Université de Manchester au Royaume-Uni. Elle est professeure titulaire à l'Université d'Ottawa où elle occupe un poste rattaché à l'école de traduction et d'interprétation à l'école des études de l'information. Elle est l'auteur de nombreux articles de recherche de plusieurs monographies telles que Computer Aided Translation Technology, Working with a Specialized Language, a Practical Guide to Using Corpora avec Jennifer Pearson. Et récemment, elle a publié avec Jairo Buitrago-Ciro Machine Translation and Global Research Towards Improved Machine Translation Literacy in the Scholarly Community, un livre que je recommande à tous, disponible à la bibliothèque électronique de l'UQTR et dans lequel elle aborde certaines des questions qui seront, j'imagine, soulevées lors du séminaire d'aujourd'hui. Alors, sans plus tarder, je donne la parole à la professeure Bowker.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à professeur San Antonio pour la présentation et pour l'invitation de parler avec tous les étudiants à l'Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières, but also to the wider world, anyone who's interested in tuning in to join us. Thank you so much for the introduction. I will proceed with the presentation in English, but at the end, certainly if there are people who want to engage or discuss anything in French, I would be open to that as well. So without further ado, I'll get started. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let me just find the right file here. Okay, does that work for everyone?
Yes, it works.
A screen share? Okay, perfect. Let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger. Right, okay. So today I am going to talk to you with a little bit of a tribute to Bob Dylan about how the times they are a-changin' for us here in the translation profession. And what I'd really like to focus on a little bit is this question of social responsibility. What do we as translators owe to the wider community with regard to machine translation? So that's the angle that I'm going to be discussing today. And of course, I'm sure that you're all familiar with machine translation, but I'm going to give just a very, very brief history in case anyone is joining us, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So machine translation is talked about a lot today, but it's actually a relatively old technology. It's kind of ironic to think that one of the most challenging tasks for a computer was one of the earliest things that developers tried to do. So when we go back to the post-Second World War period, that's actually when machine translation technology was first attempted. So at that time, what the developers were trying to do was to get computers to process language in a way that is similar to how we study language, how we process language ourselves as humans. So the approach was to create gigantic bilingual dictionaries and then to code a very complex set of grammar rules about how the words in the dictionaries could be combined together to make phrases, to make sentences, and to make texts. So that was the early approach to machine translation. We now refer to it as a rule-based approach because it does require that complex coding of lots and lots of grammar rules. And this was the approach that was in place, used for almost 50 years. So a lot of time, a lot of effort went into trying to develop machine translation systems that used dictionaries and rules. And they had a relatively limited success. There was progress. Of course, we in Canada are always very proud to mention the Météo system, the system that translates weather reports. But apart from very specialized applications, such as the Météo system, the progress that was made was minimal. In fact, it was a little bit disappointing, given the time, energy, and money that was invested in that project. The results were kind of just mediocre. It was always quite obvious what was a machine translation. We can talk about it a little bit maybe as translationese. The machine translation was often the subject of humor, lots of jokes about how machine translation didn't do a good job. And so it was a technology that was, although as I said, a lot of attention had been paid to it, it was a technology that was not very widely used, and certainly not by people in the language professions or by everyday people. Just before the turn of the century, or rather the turn of the millennium, so in the 1990s, the approach to machine translation changed radically. You can imagine that over the 50-year period since the Second World War up to the turn of the millennium, computer technology had changed quite a bit. Things were faster, able to process more. Something else that changed was the fact that we created texts in electronic form. So, thanks to word processing, we were able to generate a lot of documents in electronic form. And so this made it possible for machine translation researchers and developers to think of another way of tackling machine translation. And so we entered what we call the corpus-based or the data-driven era of machine translation. And there have been a few different ways of trying to use this big data to create a machine translation system. One of the ones that sort of took the lead in the early part of this millennium was statistical machine translation. And you can imagine that if you give a computer a very, very large bilingual parallel corpus, so that's a corpus of source language texts and their translations into a target language. And if you give it that parallel corpus of previously translated text that have been done by professional translators, so we're pretty confident that the quality is good, what would happen if we then ask the machine to consult that data and use it as a reference to calculate the probability that a new text, a new sentence, a new fragment of a text would be translated in a way similar to how it had been translated in the past? So this was essentially the underlying, the essence of statistical machine translation, letting computers do what they're good at. So unlike the rule-based approach where we have the dictionaries and the grammar rules, computers are not inherently good at grammar, but they are good at number crunching and pattern matching. So with the statistical approach to machine translation, we saw a huge jump in the quality of the output. It wasn't perfect, but it was significantly better. So in this data-driven approach to machine translation, we saw an increase in quality. And the statistical approach to machine translation was the dominant paradigm for probably about 20 years, say from the mid-1990s up until very recently, until around 2015, 2016. And now, when we talk about machine translation and what has all of the media so abuzz, everybody's talking about it, is a new paradigm, which we call neural machine translation, because it makes use of neural networks, artificial neural networks. And this is essentially a form of artificial intelligence. It uses machine learning techniques. So it's still data-driven because it still needs a corpus. In fact, it needs an even bigger corpus, parallel translated texts by, high-quality previously translated texts. But now machine learning techniques or artificial intelligence techniques are applied. My job, I feel today, is not really to explain the underlying technology because it's a little bit complex, and I think we don't need as translators to understand every single detail of the underlying technology. But what we can say is that the quality of the output has gone up again. So we saw with rule-based translation for a long time, only minimal progress for about 50 years. Statistical machine translation, the quality took a big jump. And now with neural machine translation in the past 3 or 4 years, it's taken another big jump in quality. So that's kind of where we are today, where machine translation has gone from being a bit of a joke to being something that's worth taking a little bit seriously, but it's also worth kind of thinking about how and whether and when this technology can best be used. So that's our job, I think, today, to think about those questions. Okay. So I did say the times, they are a-changin', and I think that's true. I believe that we're in a sort of evolving landscape at the moment. Machine translation has been around for 70 years, but in addition to the underlying technology, we see a few other changes have taken place as well. So I'm going to talk about 3 of them now. The first one is the fact that machine translation is what I like to say out there in the wild. The second one is the fact that machine translation is very, very easy to use. What implications does that have? And the third is the one that I've just discussed a little bit, the fact that machine translation has undergone another paradigm shift to neural machine translation. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. The first thing that has changed is that until very recently, machine translation was a technology that was not available to the general public. It was in the hands primarily of researchers, developers, and to some extent, to language professionals. Machine translation has been in use in kind of restricted contexts for some time now. So in the European Union, for example, where they have a tremendous challenge dealing with more than 20 different languages and all of the combinations of those different languages. So in the European Union, they have been very motivated to explore machine translation since about the 1970s or 80s. But it was always in the hands of translators or language professionals. What has really changed in the past 10 years is the fact that now machine translation is available to everyone, or to at least to everyone who has an internet connection. So this started happening in 2006. Google was the first company to launch a free online machine translation system, Google Translate, which I'm pretty sure everyone is already quite familiar with. And of course, they were followed by other tools, other companies. So Microsoft Bing Translator, for example, DeepL is a free online machine translation system, Baidu, Yandex, there are really quite a few of them now. And so we see that anyone who has an internet connection can have access to machine translation. This is really quite a different thing. I mean, less than 15 years since this happened. So it's quite a new situation, relatively speaking. And we see not only can people access machine translation, but they do access machine translation. They use it for many, many tasks. Obvious ones are things like when you're traveling, and order something in a restaurant, or interact with people in the country that you're visiting. But they are also being used for things like genealogy research, people who are interested in their family history. Maybe they have ancestors coming from another country, so they're interested in accessing some of those records. Even in professional contexts, so international companies that are looking to find out if there are patents that have been applied for patents in other countries, might use machine translation to help them understand what those patents are about. Social media is another big use for machine translation. And in fact, when it comes to social media, some of the platforms like Twitter, for example, Facebook is another one, have machine translation widgets actually embedded into them. So it makes machine translation very easy to use. And essentially, we're entering a time when machine translation is a little bit ubiquitous, which means it's kind of all around us. It's kind of hard to avoid, actually. Not only do we not have to seek it out, we have to make an effort not to be aware or come into contact with machine translation. If you're interested in this idea of average everyday people using machine translation for all kinds of things, I would encourage you to visit the website of a PhD student at the University of Tampere in Finland. Her name is Mary Nurminen, and she's started a website of what she calls MT stories. So little kind of glimpses into how people are using machine translation in their everyday lives. So it's really quite a fun website to explore if you're interested in that topic. So that's our first situation. Machine translation is out of the hands of professionals, or rather not only in the hands of professionals, but out there in the hands of everyday people. So that's a big change in our situation in the past sort of 10, 15 years. The next point that I want to make is that machine translation is very easy to use. And I put a little question mark, maybe it's too easy, because what happens when things are too easy to use is that we don't really think about them. We kind of go on autopilot, and we can use machine translation technology in a very unthinking way or in a non-critical way, because really, all we need to know to use this technology is how to copy, paste, and click. Or, as I just mentioned, sometimes these tools are actually embedded into other platforms, in which case we don't even copy and paste, we just click. It really couldn't get any easier. But just because it's easy doesn't mean that we should go on autopilot in order to use it. Maybe we do need to think about it a little bit and be a kind of informed and critical user. So this is quite different than some of the other technologies that we encounter. If you are someone who is in the translation profession or studying to be a translator, you might have encountered some other types of tools, probably things like terminology management tools, maybe translation memory systems. If we think about a common well-used translation memory system like SDL Trados, for example, it's definitely not just one click, right? There's a bit of an investment going on in terms of your time and effort. It's quite a sophisticated tool. And those tools are not out there accessible to the general public. For one thing, they're pretty expensive, and they really do require specialized knowledge in order to operate them. In contrast, machine translation, we've already seen it's free, online, and now we see that it's very, very easy to use. So that's the second sort of change that we've seen in our landscape, our technological landscape in the field of translation. And the third one I talked about a little bit earlier is the fact that we've seen a new approach to machine translation, and one that is proving to be quite successful. So we went from the rule-based machine translation, which was not really ever seen as much of a threat to professional translators. As I said, it produced a kind of noticeable translation ease, meaning it was quite recognizable as a translation and not necessarily a particularly elegant one. We saw that the media picked up on it, made lots of jokes about machine translation. We also were kind of feeling smug and superior, and often, kind of pointed out that machine translation could not do things like translate Christmas carols or fortune cookies, poetry. We're always looking for ways to kind of show that machine translation is not as good as humans. Some of these are not totally fair because machine translation was not ever necessarily intended to translate Christmas carols or fortune cookies. But in any case, it kind of made translators feel good and not too threatened by machine translation when it was a rule-based approach. We saw that the paradigm shift to statistical machine translation brought new quality levels. All of a sudden, we had to sort of sit up, start paying attention. Machine translation was turning out texts that in some circumstances could be seen as useful. And this has increased even more now that we're in the age of neural machine translation. Now, I'm not trying to say that in the past machine translation was not a threat and now it is. I don't necessarily think that it's a threat. I'm not really worried about there not being a role for professional translators, but I think we do need to be aware of machine translation and how it has improved and how it might be something that we can work with. Let's get out in front of it and be part of the discussion rather than just laughing at it and thinking it's going to go away, because I don't think it is. So now we're in a situation where neural machine translation has raised the bar on quality. I will emphasize, though, that the output of machine translation is still not perfect. But what we have seen is that it is more viable than it used to be. So it could be that now we are able to really see machine translation as a tool that can produce a draft that is worth post-editing. Maybe in the past, the drafts were so difficult to post-edit that it was a better strategy to translate it from scratch. But now maybe post-editing is becoming a viable strategy. And we may even find that there are some needs for which raw machine translation is fine. And again, I don't think we need to be threatened by that. Really, translators did not cry too much when Météo was used to translate weather forecasts. Can you imagine that if you, as a translator, your job was to translate weather forecasts for 35 or 40 hours a week? That would be a pretty boring job, I think. So there are some applications of machine translation where maybe it's actually a good thing that the machines are able to take on those tasks. And there may be other tasks where there is more of a challenge or more of a need for finesse, for really good quality human input. And so I think that really our job is to reflect a little bit, not to have a knee-jerk reaction that machine translation is bad and it's taking away our jobs, but to think about how there are some jobs that perhaps we don't want to do and that a machine might actually be a good solution for. So again, we're in a period where I think we need to reflect about technology, not just react, but reflect. Okay, so that is the third thing. So we've seen in our evolving landscape, machine translation is now out in the wild, in the hands of everyday people, not just language professionals. We've seen that it's a technology that's very, very easy to use, and that the quality has gone up, not perfect, but higher, and may actually be reasonable for some people's needs. So where does that bring us now? Does it mean that we instinctively know how to use or optimize this technology just because it's accessible, easy to use, and of a higher quality? I would say no. It's not because it's easy to use that we will make good decisions about how it should be used. So I think that we have reached a point where we need to develop what I'm calling a sort of machine translation literacy, une approche raisonnée de la traductique. So we need to really develop our critical judgment as a user of this technology. So machine translation literacy is kind of a new type of digital literacy, I would say. So we've all been, I think, comfortable for some time with the idea that technology is taking on a bigger role in our lives in general, and that we need to learn digital skills in order to be able to function as, citizens in this information society. And so digital literacy is a concept that is not new, and you've probably encountered it before. And it's actually a series, I think, of skills, digital literacy. And I see machine translation literacy as being one of these skills that we can add to our digital literacy toolbox. And digital literacy, interestingly enough, doesn't focus so much on the technology, but rather on the use of the technology. So digital literacy emphasizes critical thinking rather than technical competence. And I think that this applies very well to machine translation literacy as well. It's a cognitive issue rather than a techno-procedural one, right? You don't need a tutorial or a manual on how to use machine translation in terms of which buttons to push or where to click. That is so easy, so obvious. So machine translation is not really a how to use the technology, but we might consider questions such as whether to use the technology in a given situation. When is it a good choice to use machine translation? When should we choose another tool or no tool at all, or kind of a combination of approaches? Why would we choose machine translation over other options that are available to us? Maybe we are working in a situation where time is actually more important than elegance. We might find ourselves where we have to translate a text, and unless it's delivered to people very quickly, like in a crisis situation, there's no point in having the text after the crisis has passed. So we might say, well, sometimes time is really a critical factor. And while we don't want a poor quality text, we might be willing to take a text that's not quite as elegant as a human could produce, as long as we could get it quickly. Sometimes budget, money is a factor, right? When we're dealing with nonprofit organizations, organizations like the Red Cross that are on the ground trying to help people in the wake of a disaster, they don't have tons of money. They're a charitable organization. So maybe for some of their needs, a low-cost solution might be a good thing for them to consider. So I think we need to, broaden our scope and consider a little bit more the purpose, the need, and some of the other factors. Maybe cost is a factor, maybe time is a factor, and that might be, helping to guide our decision about which technologies to use. So these questions about machine translation, as I said, they're not really necessarily the technical how to use the technology, but whether, when, why to use it. If we are thinking about how, we might think about how in the context of human-computer interaction. So how can we, as users, help to improve the output of the tool? How can we help to make the tool better able to respond to our needs? So human-computer interaction, one of the ways that we can interact with machine translation is through post-editing. That's the most obvious one. We take the output of the machine translation system and we can work to edit it, to improve it. But there are other ways. Maybe we could actually influence the output at the input stage. If we were to improve the quality of the source text, to remove some of the potential ambiguities that it might have, would that allow the machine to do a better job of translating? So thinking a little bit about what our role can be working with the technology in order to get better results for everyone. So when we start asking this type of question, I think that's when we kind of raise ourselves to the level of a critical user, an informed user, not just someone who copies, pastes, and clicks without thinking about it, but someone who's really using their judgment to make good decisions about the technology, when it's appropriate, how it can help, how we can work with it to, improve the results. That to me is what machine translation literacy is about, rather than a how-to manual. That's a little bit more of a reflective exercise. So, how is the translation profession responding to machine translation? This is, I think, for me, a very interesting question. How are we collectively, as translators, dealing with this situation, this evolving landscape, these changing times? What is our kind of outlook and attitude, if you will, a little bit towards machine translation? And I recently read a very lovely description about the 4 stages of machine translation acceptance by translators. This was in the proceedings of a recent conference, a conference that took place in September. And a freelance translator had made a contribution to this conference, and she talked about from her own personal perspective, these 4 stages of machine translation acceptance. And she said the first stage was one that she called nescience, which is a little bit sort of ignorance, like not being aware of something. I don't know about the technology, therefore it does not exist. So a little bit like maybe being an ostrich, burying your head in the sand and just pretending that, maybe this technology is going to go away. If I don't acknowledge it, it's just going to disappear. So a little bit of a naive attitude, perhaps, but in her view, the first sort of stage of acceptance. Number 2, kind of a contemptuous attitude. I hate this technology. I'm going to mock this technology. I'm going to make fun of it. I'm going to, point out the fact that it can't translate poetry and therefore it's a silly technology and it's not worth my time. Or I'm going to feel a little bit insecure. And often we do, right? We make fun of things because we feel a little bit insecure. So machine translation is going to steal my job. So it's bad, bad, bad. Once we kind of work through that stage, she said there's a kind of reluctant adoption and shame. And I think this is where a lot of translators are at the moment. They are using machine translation, but they don't want to admit it. They somehow think that there's really something shameful about using the tool. I do not feel that way. I don't think there's any shame at all in using machine translation, but I think that we should use it sensibly. And after all, we're professionals, so we should be able to use any of the tools that are at our disposal. But if we're professionals, we want to make sure that we're using those tools responsibly. So that would bring us to the 4th stage of acceptance, where we get to know the tool. We use it, not in secret, but openly. And this, again, was the perspective of the translator at the conference. She said, eventually I've begun to change my perspective, and now I look back and I wonder, why did it take me so long? Well, I don't think we should beat ourselves up either for that. Change is hard, change is difficult, and I think what's important is to make progress. So I really enjoyed her description of these 4 stages of machine translation acceptance. And as I said, I really think that translators are somewhere in between 3 and 4 at the moment. But I really hope that none of you are back in stage 1, because I don't think you're going to be keeping up. Everyone else is going to be moving ahead, and there's no point, I think, in hoping that this technology is going to go away. It's not going to go away, but maybe we also don't want it to go away, right? We don't want to go back to the days where we had to translate the weather forecasts. That's a boring job. We want to have the interesting work for ourselves. So hopefully we will all be moving through these stages towards number 4, where we accept the technology and actually come to appreciate what it can offer and how we can work with it to make our lives better. Because that's what technology hopefully should do, right? At the end of the day, it should make our lives better. So we want to learn, how can we make the most of this tool and help ourselves to enjoy our careers and to really be able to focus on those parts of the job that we love so much. Okay, so that was the 4 stages of acceptance. How are translators getting there? It is a new world. The landscape has changed. How are we dealing with this technology? Do we all have to independently struggle and kind of come to terms with it on our own? Happily, I would say no. I think that there's a pretty good support system out there. Certainly for the next generation of translators, people who are in training, working towards becoming translation professionals, I think that most translator education programs today recognize the need to incorporate machine translation training into a translator training program, and I believe that most of them are doing so. Maybe not always perfectly, it's a learning process for translator educators too. And so I think, I'm not saying there isn't room for improvement or there isn't more that we could be doing, but it's certainly a very hot topic of discussion. I don't think that translator training programs are ignoring the technology. I think they are really doing their best to help students who are currently training to become the next generation of translators to come to grips with this tool. So that's great for people who are at university now, but what about the people who graduated 5 years ago or 15 years ago? How are they kind of being supported in this very rapidly evolving, quickly changing landscape? I think that professional translators associations are, for the most part, stepping up. So OTIAC, for example, which is the Ordre des traducteurs, terminologues et interprètes agréés du Québec, is one professional association that is offering continuing education for its members. So I happen to notice that there's a machine translation for freelancers workshop coming up in March, so next month. So OTIAC is on it. OTIAC is recognizing that some of their members may be struggling a little bit to figure out, how does this technology fit into my workflow, and looking for support about how to make the most of it. And OTIAC is offering a workshop. So that's just one example. But again, I think that professional translators associations are definitely trying to help their members deal with this evolution. So hats off to them. So in general, then, we might say that translators are being supported. They're getting help to learn how to deal with machine translation, how to fit it into their workflow, when it might be helpful, when it might be a good choice, when they should not turn to machine translation, but to another tool or to their brain instead. So that's all well and good for translators. But what is happening to the rest of society? We saw that translation tools are in the wild. So are average users instinctively becoming critical and informed users of machine translation technology? Or do they need help as well? And if they do need help, who could help them? So again, remember, it's not about who could help them learn which button to click, but rather who could help them make an informed choice about whether to click the button at all. Okay. So the question that I would like to throw out to you, and I'll give you my opinion on it, but I'm very interested in the discussion period to hear what you are thinking yourselves, is whether or not we, as a profession, so the translation group collectively, whether we're living up to our social responsibility when it comes to machine translation. Do we have a social responsibility? And if so, what is it with regard to machine translation? This idea of social responsibility and translation is something that is being talked about more and more in the literature. So one of the first places that I noticed it was in an article by Mona Baker, very well-known translation researcher, translation theorist, translation professor from Manchester, and Carol Meyer. They wrote this article together. Carol Meyer is from Kent State University, translation program in the United States. And they wrote it from an ethical perspective, and they called their article Ethics in Interpreter and Translator Training. And this was in 2011, so almost a decade ago. And they identified the fact that perhaps translators need to think a little bit beyond just their clients. Okay, so for many of us, we've learned and talked a lot in our translator training programs about faithfulness. Should we be faithful to the source text, the target text, to the author, to the audience? But we never really seem to look beyond the immediate text or audience or client of the job that's at hand. And Baker and Meyer were among the first who suggested that maybe we need to take a look a little bit further afield and consider the wider community. And at that time, 10 years ago, they observed that relatively little had been written on the impact of technological developments on the way that professional translators and interpreters think about their relationship with others. So they called attention really to a gap. We hadn't been thinking about that. So that was, as I said, in 2011, almost 10 years ago. A little bit more recently, Joanna Drugan and Rebecca Tipton, two translation researchers from the United Kingdom, had decided that still we were not talking or thinking quite enough about these issues. And they put together a special issue of a journal. The journal is called The Translator, and the special issue focused on translation, ethics, and social responsibility. And they, again, called attention to the fact that perhaps decisions and actions by translators might have an impact on people beyond their translation community. And they said, we understand social responsibility as individuals' responsibility to the wider society in which they live. That is, interpreters and translators' responsibility to the broader social context beyond the immediate translated encounter. So that's as recently as just 2-3 years ago, still not a lot of attention being paid to this, but I think that is starting to change. I think social justice in general, not just in the translation field, but as a wider issue, is getting more attention. And so I think we as a profession need to be thinking a little bit about our social responsibility. And for me, social responsibility in connection to machine translation is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. So if we think about how our profession, so collectively, not just individuals, but collectively, how do we talk about machine translation with the general public? And something that I've noticed is that we are not necessarily talking about it in a way that pleases me. So I don't know, maybe I'm an oddball, maybe this is not a shared opinion. But for me, I think that when I see a message like the following one on the website of the Canadian Translators, Terminologists, and Interpreters Council, I have some concerns. I think that professional associations definitely see that they have a duty to protect the public, and I think that's great. That's why we have a certification process in Canada. If you want to be a certified translator, it's because the profession as a whole wants to assure that you are being held to a certain standard in order to deliver good quality work to the public. So I have no problem with this idea of duty to protect the public, duty of care towards the public. But when it comes to machine translation, it seems that the message that is getting sent is that you should not use machine translation because it's not as good as a professional. I have no argument with the factual accuracy of that. I agree, machine translation is not as good as a professional. But is it fair to imply to the public that they should not ever use machine translation? Are we giving them enough information? Are we helping them to make informed and critical decisions? Is it realistic to say that users should call upon a certified translator for all of their translation requirements? Are we being nuanced in this argument, or are we being just a little bit too scaremongering? So typically the message that I see coming from professional associations about machine translation is that machine translation is bad and you should only hire certified translators for all your translation needs. So CTIC is one example, but it's not the only one. There's another association called the International Association of Professional Translators and Interpreters, and the message that's coming from them is a little bit the same. Again, I'm not arguing with the fact that professional translators produce higher quality work than machine translation. I agree, of course they do. But is it always necessary to have a professional translation for all your translation needs? Is it responsible enough of us as a profession to simply say, danger, danger, machine translation bad, use it at your own risk, without helping people to figure out when it would be risky to use machine translation and when it might actually be okay to use machine translation? So these types of messages make me think that perhaps there's a little bit of work to do. Perhaps we could do better in terms of helping the wider society learn about when machine translation might be a good choice and when it might not be. So yeah, my feeling is that perhaps we could do better, that it may not be helpful enough to just give a warning against machine translation without giving people a little bit more information about how to make good decisions. I also find that some of those messages that are out there seem to be coming from a place of self-interest rather than protection of the public. I think that translators are not great at acknowledging the idea that not all translation jobs are the same. They don't all need the same level of quality. And this concept of fit for purpose translation is something that is emerging now as something to be considered alongside technology related choices, I think. There are perhaps some tasks for which a machine translation or an edited machine translation is actually reasonable. And I mentioned some of them earlier. Cases when time is a factor, when perhaps the budget is a factor legitimately. And so, it could be the case that machine translation is actually a better choice, or a machine translation with a combination of post-editing is a better choice than hiring a full-blown, professional translation job. I also question the sense or whether people really will not use machine translation. It's free, it's available, and is a warning on a website like don't use MT, is that kind of naive? I think realistically people are going to be using this technology. So perhaps it's better for us to actually think about helping them to use it in a smart way. So what might a better message be? How could we perhaps give more nuanced information to people? Here are some of the ideas that I have. I'm not going to talk about them in a lot of detail, but I will mention them. I think that we might help people realize that not all machine translation systems are the same. And by that, I don't mean that some are good and some are bad. What I mean is that since each of these systems is being trained on a different set of training data, these big parallel corpora that we talked about earlier, not all companies use the same corpus. So their different machine translation systems are learning different things. So what I actually mean by this point is not that there are good systems and bad systems, but if you're not happy with the translation that you're getting, why not try another system? If they are all free and online, you could try more than one. So don't necessarily think that Google Translate is the only system out there. That's one kind of piece of information that might be worth sharing. Similarly, we're not going to train all these people in the general public to become translators, but we might socialize the idea that there are different types of translation tasks and that machine translation might be a better or a worse choice depending on the task. So maybe we're not going to use machine translation to translate medical texts or legal texts. That might be some case where this warning, perhaps don't trust machine translation is a well-motivated warning. But for social media, are we really expecting that people will hire a professional translator to translate a Facebook message? I don't think that's realistic. So helping people realize there is a difference between types of translation tasks, and sometimes machine translation might be okay, and sometimes you really might want to think twice. Something that I think the general public doesn't necessarily realize is that privacy and confidentiality are an issue. What you type into a machine translation window in a free online system doesn't disappear when you close the window. So don't put sensitive information in a machine translation system. I'll skip down to the last one, garbage in, garbage out. I mentioned that earlier as well. Maybe people don't think about the fact that a good way to interact with machine translation is before you put a text into it, you have the opportunity to make sure that your text is well written or clearly expressed. And by eliminating the ambiguity in the source text, you might actually get a better output. So these are ideas for things that I think might be helpfully included in a sort of wider campaign of machine translation literacy. Just to give you a few examples, as I said, this is a project that I've been working on for the past year now. So some of the things that I've done, I've been working with international students at the University of Ottawa and at Concordia University. And international students are people who come from other countries and who, in this case, are typically following their courses in English, but English is not their native language. So they're interested in learning how machine translation can be useful for them and how they can maybe get the most out of this technology. I've also just recently started working with the Ottawa Public Library, and we are going to be unrolling some workshops for newcomers to Canada. So again, people who are immigrating to Canada from other countries, speakers of other languages, maybe they need help trying to navigate the system here, how to find housing, how to get a job. So some of them are interested in using machine translation as well. And how can we help them be more critical and informed users? I've written quite a few blog posts now in various places trying to get the word out. So these are some examples of what I think is perhaps a little bit more of a helpful attitude towards the wider public than simply saying, machine translation is terrible, hire me, I'm a professional translator. Okay. If you're interested in learning more about machine translation literacy, I co-authored a book that came out last year with Jairo Buitragosiro, and it was looking particularly at using machine translation in a research context. So again, a little bit with those international students and even faculty members who are not native speakers of English, but who are publishing and interacting with the scientific literature in English. If you're interested particularly in this question of social responsibility, I wrote a short article for a conference proceedings just at the end of last year. I'm working on a more a meatier article on this subject at the moment, but you might like to hear my initial thoughts, which are captured in the conference proceedings. And we have a project website and Twitter feed if you're interested in following and learning more. So that's all that I'm going to say about it, but I just jotted down a few potential discussion questions, and you might have questions of your own as well.
Well, thank you very much, Lynne. It was very, very interesting and enriching. I don't know how you want to proceed about the questions, or I mean the questions that you've just published, or
those are just in case nobody had questions of their own. But if people have their own questions, I'm very happy to take those. Yeah.
Okay, so while we see whether people are going to ask some questions on the chat or maybe ask to intervene with their audio and video, I do have a question.
Okay.
As a university professor, I teach translation. I guess you might know what I'm going to ask is, how do you see the future of translation teaching with the availability of machine translation and the improved quality of the output?
So it's definitely a question that is on my mind, like it's on your mind. It's rapidly evolving. I think that we need to help the students learn to use tools, because why would we want to prevent them from using tools? We wouldn't say to people in any other profession, oh, don't use the latest technology, right? We don't want to go to the dentist and have them use a pair of pliers to pull out our teeth with no anesthetic, because that's how they used to do it. So I think we do need to keep up with the times. The challenge is whether we should be introducing the tools, this is for me, at the beginning of the program or at the end of the program. So I'm at the moment a little bit in favor of introducing them kind of late middle of the program, like maybe around third year of a 4-year program, because I do think there's a benefit to being able to translate without the tools. First, in order to appreciate limitations of the tools and strengths of the tools as well. So I think, I mean, it's hard for us because we did learn to translate without tools. So we don't have kind of the comparator situation. But for me, I do think I appreciate my own knowledge of translation in order to help me assess whether it's a good choice or a bad choice. So I'm in favor of letting students use tools, but I'm at the moment leaning towards introducing them a little bit later in the program. Machine translation anyway, yeah. Okay. Some other tools, I think, corpora, terminology management can be introduced sooner for sure, but machine translation a little bit later. And I do think we need to teach post-editing. I think it's an in-demand skill, and I think we would be doing a disservice to our students to pretend that post-editing is not a job opportunity and an option after graduation.
But now that you talk about post-editing, do you see in 10 years' time that we will still have translation courses, or that it will all just be post-editing courses?
What has been emerging in the conversations that I've been able to listen in on is that light post-editing is kind of disappearing. We used to talk about sort of light post-editing and maximal or full post-editing. But now the level of machine translation output is sort of good enough that light post-editing is not really needed that much. We may still need to do a quick verification. Of course, we don't want meaning errors to be introduced, but there aren't very many stylistic improvements that need to be made now that we would have made in a light post-editing context before. But we're seeing a discussion emerging in a difference between, I don't really like the terminology, but this is the terminology that's being used, so I'm going to use it, between what's being described as a premium market and a bulk market. So the premium market is very high-end jobs that need a lot of subject field knowledge, a lot of specialized knowledge, and very particular writing styles. So legal translation is a good example. Medical translation is a good example. So we don't want, and we can't, in fact, have legal texts translated in a way that is vague or, you know, kind of not correct, because law has to be applied and the legal translation has to be right. Medical too. We don't want there to be any question about, you know, what dose of medication someone's getting or what option they should be having for medical treatment. So those are kind of the premium end. And as you can imagine, to be a good legal translator, you really need to understand the law. So this type of specialized work is being billed as premium work, and that's where the job opportunities are. At the other end of the scale, the bulk market, this is being characterized as texts that don't need to necessarily be elegant. Okay, they do need to be correct. We're never, I think, going to be approaching a situation where we don't care about the accuracy of the text. We want it to be correct, but the style may not be that important. So at the bulk end of the market, it's volume. People are making their living by volume. At the premium end of the market, they're making their living by quality. So if you are in a volume market, you need to have a high turnover. So you almost cannot do that without the help of a tool. So I don't like the terminology because it sort of implies that one is better than the other, but there are two options, right? There are two options. So you might decide that you're happy to kind of churn it out. And if that is okay with you, then there's still work to be done in that area. And if you're someone who's interested in having more control over the text, doing more of the work on your own, then the premium market, this very specialized market, is what's emerging as a place that humans are still the better option over tools.
Thank you very much. I think we have Professor Martinez Gomez, who would like to ask a question.
Okay.
I don't know.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Bowker, and thank you, Professor San Martin, for organizing this. As Professor San Martin said, I'm a professor at the City University of New York.
Okay.
And I had a question, but I have a follow-up to what you were just talking about. So I guess I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one regarding how do we as translation instructors deal with machine translation literacy in the classroom? Do you have any examples of activities or strategies that you've found useful in the workshops that you've taught?
So the workshops that I've been doing are actually not with translation professionals at all, like not people who are even training to be translation professionals. So I think it's a different market. At the moment, I've been working with international students, but they're students maybe in physics or in business or in education. So their subject matter is different. They're not training to become translators. So the activities that I do with them are a lot of pre-editing, because what's happening is that they are writing their assignments in their native language, and then they're machine translating them into English in order to hand them into their professors. So we work a lot on pre-editing because they actually have control of the source text. They're the author of the source text. In a professional translation training situation, that's not usually the case. It's not usually the translator who wrote the source text, and they may not have a lot of influence on the source text. They may just be told to just deal with the source text that they have, in which case they're going to be doing more work on the post-editing side, I think, rather than on the pre-editing side. So they're kind of different markets, if I could describe them that way, in terms of what the machine translation literacy workshop would look like.
Right.
I also think that most professional translators will want to be a little bit cautious about just taking their client's text and putting it into a free online system. And in some cases, they're actually not allowed to do that. There are confidentiality issues. So I am thinking that in the future, more professional translators are going to be not using those free online systems, but more like offline, more secure type systems, systems that are integrated maybe with their translation memory tool as well. So again, the advice might be a little bit different because they're using a different tool in a different way.
Right. I was thinking more along the lines of how to develop that critical thinking that you were talking about, whether to use machine translation when and why. Right? If you had any.
So one exercise that I like to do with students is an exercise that I call fast, good, and cheap. Pick any two. And so you can actually have a text and divide your students into 3 different groups. And for each group, you give them 2 of those parameters. So one group has to do the translation fast and cheap. The other group has to do the translation fast but good, and budget is not an issue. And then the last group has to do the translation good but cheap. So it's kind of, what are you prioritizing? Is elegance the most important thing? Is speed the most important thing? Or if you're on a budget, is cost the most important thing? And, you know, they're never all the most important thing, or if a client says they're all the most important thing, then they're being unrealistic. They can't have it all. But what happens is the students come up with very different translations of the same text when they are working under different conditions.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I'm going to leave the floor to anybody else. And if I have another opportunity, I'll ask my second question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bowker. It was really nice to hear from you. Very interesting. I was wondering, and perhaps I have an answer to your first question about the social responsibility of translators. I'm wondering, can we have a responsibility if we don't have power? That's a question. So I could refer to empowerment of, translators. Do they have the power or the ability to change things? I would ask you this question.
Well, I think that we will never get the power if we don't at least try. So I think there are small things that we could do. And I think even just changing those messages on the websites of the professional associations would be a small step in the right direction. I think that we could give a little bit more nuanced information rather than just saying, machine translation is not as good as a professional translator, so hire a professional translator. I think we could give them a little bit more nuanced information. Are we going to solve the problem overnight? Are we going to succeed in all cases? No, you can provide information, but you can't force people to take it, right? You take your advice. But I do think that we could at least start. And I think that small steps might incrementally add up, and we might have more power than we think we do, but we're never going to be able to exercise it if we don't even make an effort.
Right. Yeah, it's so true. Thank you. Just another small comment. I was wondering when you were talking about social responsibility and talking about MT to other people than translators, and I'm wondering if translation could not be teach at the same time as language teaching. Like learning a language, would it be great if we could learn language and learn translation at the same time? What do you think about this possibility?
I think that translation is sometimes used as a piece, a tool for language learning. It's funny, again, I think we're in such a special and unique situation in Canada where translation and language learning, you know, in a bilingual country, I think we are very privileged. We've kind of grown up with this idea that there are two languages and that, you know, translation is sort of woven into the fabric of Canada. Do all bilinguals make good translators? Not necessarily, but certainly you need at least to be bilingual to have a hope of being a translator. So I don't know. I honestly don't know. It's a very interesting question. But okay. Yeah, I don't have a nice answer for that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your answers.
So is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? If not, I think that we will call it a day.
Okay.
Well, I want to really thank you for giving us this wonderful seminar. And I don't know if Eric would like to say anything.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bowker. I think it's an interesting field of we didn't speak about the research areas that are bousculé by this new trend of MT, because there's a lot of changes that are going to happen, I think, in our research areas.
I agree with you. Yeah.
And that's another subject, I guess, for another conference, online conference at UQTR.
Excellent. Well, I'll be sure to tune in for that one.
So no, I thank you very much. It was really interesting, and I think it's a very good angle you approach integrating MT, and I agree totally with you with the importance of integrating it in our translation. I guess it's yeah, I agree totally. I think we have a question from Eve. She's asking if there's a space for the translators in these research areas. I think I could answer for you if you agree, but I think there is. Obviously, there is one space for translators. It's all oriented towards translators taking their place
exactly
in this area.
Yeah. So one exciting area that's getting a lot of attention at the moment is the question of, it's described as ergonomics. So how are translators, we can understand ergonomics in a physical way, like, you know, do you have a good chair? Do you have the right light in your office in order to work? But we can also understand ergonomics in a cognitive way. And one of the questions that I have, it's a little bit like the opposite of what's happening with machine translation. Machine translation is so easy to use, but other tools seem to be almost overly complicated. Like Trados now is such a sophisticated tool that it's very difficult to teach students how to use that tool in, like, you know, one workshop or 1 3-hour class. But there are so many tools that we try to learn now. So for me, it's really interesting to think about where's the kind of threshold, the cognitive overload, and how complex are these tools and how much harder is that making our job? Tools are supposed to make our job easier, but have we reached a kind of point where some of these tools are making our job harder? So that's one area that's kind of being researched. The whole human element, I think, whether it's as a user of a tool or whether it's as a kind of partner of a tool, is another thing to kind of to think about. I mentioned human-computer interaction, but they're also talking about I think it's called HIT, human, it's the human element of the technology piece. And there's a lot of work going on there. One of my colleagues at the University of Ottawa is very interested in how we can interact with tools not using keyboards and mouses. So how is the whole speech and voice technology side of things coming in to play? Are we going to be dictating our translations? Is that harder, more cognitively demanding than using the keyboard? So I think there's tons. Anyone who's interested in going into research, there's so much to explore in relation to technology now. It's a very research active and exciting kind of area to be in. Yeah. Those are just a few that I've mentioned. There's lots and lots, but yes, there is space for the human. It's up to us to make that space our own. I think that's, for me, it's more important for translators to be part of the conversation, because if we don't join in the conversation, things are going to happen around us and we might get stuck with what other people decide for us. Whereas it's better for us to be part of the conversation and to make our voices heard and help to design tools in a way that makes sense to us, rather than receiving tools that someone else thinks make sense for us.
Yeah, exactly. It all reminds me also with the debate we had in the 1980s when I was studying translation. There was a lot of debate. The teachers were asking us not to use bilingual dictionaries. It reminds me like times are changing,
You're
but
right.
they're not changing that much.
Not changing that much. No, you're right. I mean, a dictionary is a tool, and now we would think that's ridiculous to tell a student not to use a dictionary, right?
Yeah, it's true. Really. There's also the issue of I think there's another important issue with the assessment of translation quality.
Yes.
It's like machine translation, the fact that it's so easy, cheap, almost free or almost free, it makes us thinking about, what's the quality you get when you use such a tool.
Exactly.
Yeah, and compared to a professional where you're sure or almost sure to have a perfect translation.
Very good, high quality.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's another big issue.
One interesting thing is that has been observed is that the types of mistakes that a neural machine translation system makes are different than the types of mistakes that the older technologies used to make. In the past, the problem was, I guess the problem was on both fronts in the past. There were meaning errors, but there were a lot of really awkward, clunky, unattractive stylistic errors, that translationese that we used to be able to recognize machine translation very quickly. Now, the neural machine translation systems are very good at the stylistic piece. It's harder for us to recognize that something is a machine translation now, but they are not necessarily doing a better job on the accuracy. The problem is, if we just look quickly, we will assume because it sounds good that it is good.
And specifically, students will.
Exactly. So it's like now we actually have to really pay attention, because if we just look too quickly, it sounds okay. It sounds like it's well written, so it must be right. Whereas in the past, we had that very strong signal, like it sounds awful. So we're going to check it really closely, and we're going to find the meaning errors because we're so disturbed by the stylistic errors. Now the stylistic errors are not as significant. We may, and that's again, that kind of unthinking, right? Like just doing things too fast. It's too easy. We're lulled into a false sense of security.
It's true. It's so natural. The language used is very natural, very
it's
idiomatic.
very fluid now.
Yeah, fluid.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And that really like doesn't, we really then need to do that side-by-side comparison to check the meaning, right? It's not like, oh, this part sounds funny, so it's probably an error.
Yeah, to the point where what's becoming, at least I don't know, maybe it's not that true, but what's becoming natural, the reference in naturalness is becoming machine translation more than any author or any specific author.
Yes.
Like if machine translation says it this way, sometimes it's because it's the most natural way to put it, in a language. Maybe not, I don't know, but
but it's moving in that direction anyway.
Yes, I assume so, because it's all what do you think about this kind of I don't want to take the floor. I mean, maybe there's other questions here in the audience. Does anybody want to ask a question, or
I don't think there is any other questions, so maybe we can take a last question.
Okay.
From you, I mean, from.
Okay. I was wondering, what do you think about this opposition between science and arts? Like machine translation would be like the scientific point of view of translation, and professional translator would be the artistic one. Like it's the case with the difference you made between premium and bulk markets.
A little bit, or maybe this idea of fit for purpose.
Okay.
What do we want from the text? Sometimes we want pleasure. Like that's a legitimate purpose for text, right? To give us pleasure, to be a good read, to be, agreeable, enjoyable. And sometimes we just want information. It's like, if I'm getting a memo from my department about a meeting, I'm not really anticipating any pleasure out of that memo. I just want to know what time the meeting is at, what room it's going to be in. So some texts are very functional and transactional. We're really just interested in the information, and sometimes we want more. And so I think the purpose of the text will determine a lot the translation approach that is used.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I agree with you totally.
Well, thank you very much, Lynne. That was, as I said before, that was a wonderful seminar and a very, very enriching discussion.
Merci à vous. Gros merci. C'est vraiment un plaisir pour moi. Merci pour l'invitation.
Oui, ça fait bien agréable de vous rencontrer. Puis c'est des travaux très intéressants.
Super.
Exactement. Bon, we have someone who's saying thank you from Portland, Maine.
Wow.
We have people from all over the world.
Nice. How exciting.
So, looking forward to your next publications.
Okay.
So, we'll make sure, I already follow you on Twitter, but I'll make sure to be very attentive to your next moves. So, thank you very much, and see you next time.
Okay, yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynne. See you next time.
Bonne soirée.
Bye.
Bye-bye.